All right, so you have to walk far to get anything in this school, I think. So I see we have two cools. Which is
actually, one of them is a duplicate.
I'm like, woo! We have a fanfic positive audience. So many people think we're cool.
And I have a dumb phone,
okay.
so I can't play.
For like a half second, I could dream, but that's cool. That's cool. Impressively integrated with Tolkien scholarship. That's a very impressive text message there too.
Yeah, I like that one a lot.
Yeah. And we will touch on both of those. The surprise of my life was me, of course, because I don't know how many people are familiar with my work, but I was like a super literary snob before I started writing fan fiction. So I like looked down not only on fan fiction, which I didn't even actually know existed, but like any sort of like fantasy. I swore I hated Tolkien, so you see how that worked out for me.
You seem like an unlikely person to hate fantasy, but...
Yeah, well, I mean, this was like when I was early in college, so I consider it a mistake of my youth, you know. And then, interestingly, on the opposite side, we have conservatives. So we have freedom for queerness and conservative, both on the same screen, which kind of gets into actually what we're talking about today, which is the borders of the fictional world. So today we want to discuss Tolkien-based fan fiction, specifically the websites and communities we build for the purpose of posting our work, our archives. Janet and I come from the Silmarillion Writers Guild, which is the only Silmarillion fan fiction archive on the internet. So I founded the Silmarillion Writers Guild in 2005, and I'm a moderator there, as well as on the archive Many Paths to Tread. And Janet, do you want to say a sentence or two about
Well, I'm retired, and what I'm doing with my life right now is Tolkien scholarship and writing fiction. And one of the things I do every month is I almost every month write one of the character biographies for the Silmarillion Writers Guild.
Yes. Janet's like one of our, on the SWG, is one of our like indispensable people, so she never go away. Because she writes these long, if you're not familiar with them, I can put the address up there at some point. She writes these long, very scholarly, detailed biographies on a character every month that are really impressive. So, Frodo meets Luke Skywalker. Yes, it's certainly possible in fan fiction. In fan fiction, anything is possible. So Tolkien fan fiction is unique from fanfic in general in a lot of ways. First, it has been around for more than 50 years, so it is one of the more venerable fanfic communities. As everyone here knows, if you put 100 Tolkien fans in a room, then you get 101 different opinions on how to interpret the text. And fanfic is no different. In fact, it's probably even worse because you're throwing in the people that are having Frodo meeting Luke Skywalker. You're throwing in people that are looking at the text in ways that traditional scholars don't. It's been kind of interesting for me as moving into Tolkien scholarship from fan fiction, the things that we as a fan fiction community talk about that scholarship hasn't even gotten around to yet. You know, they're ahead of us in some ways and we're ahead of them in others. Our fanfic has its foundation in a fan community that cannot agree on basic questions of what the text means, with Catholic bookshop owners and long-haired hippies laying equal claims to the correct reading. This reflects in the fan-built online spaces we have created for our fan fiction, and that is the subject of our presentation today. How the complexities and conflicts that have historically characterized the Tolkien fandom reflect in its online fan fiction archives. Far from being merely coding and a database where we store our writing, each Tolkien fan fiction archive develops its own unique culture, and the diversity of these cultures exemplify the many ways that Tolkien has been read by his fans over the decades. So now I will hand over the podium to Janet to speak her piece. And,
Eventually, I want to see my.
Right. I will. When you let me know, and I'll pull it up.
Yeah, it'll be a couple minutes.
Okay.
Okay. So the first, I want to go back to the beginning, the history of when Tolkien-inspired fan works came on the scene. The first ones were in the form of fanzines in 1959, less than 3 years after the original publication of The Lord of the Rings. Early fan writings were circulated in these off-the-grid publications, which were mimeoed or later one can consult, there's a really excellent, it's by a guy, Hunnewell, Hunnewell, in case you want to look him up. It's only available online. Has a compilation of all the fanzines produced for the next several years. I think he goes up to 1964, from 59 to 64. And it's necessarily incomplete because of the nature of their publication and distribution. So you can find everything there, everything that exists. These magazines or fanzines contain textual discussion, poetry, art, transformative fiction. It was all largely LOT, Lord of the Rings mixed, based, not as much on The Hobbit. During those early years, Hunnewell insists that it was surprising how many erudite and insightful writers who promoted Tolkien's work, and among those was sci-fi fantasy writer Marion Zimmer Bradley, who people might know, whether they're interested in sci-fi or her later Arthurian legendary stuff. I like the early stuff myself. So early fan writing, both fiction and nonfiction, was critically oriented, and there was a lot more nonfiction than there is now when we think of fan fiction or fan commentary. The first mega surge in fan involvement, however, came with the response to Tolkien's world on the part of the youth culture that evolved in the Vietnam War era. With this deluge, there also became an increase in the conflict within the fan community itself. The division between the conservative, religious, sensitive to Tolkien's point of view readers, and the crazy communes, and even student housing, names things like Lothlorien and the Shire in Berkeley, California, where I was going to school at the time. Mike Foster, in the 2006 Tolkien Encyclopedia, describes the U.S. surge of interest in LOTR in the 1960s as hippie subculture and anti-war movement, stating that the youth sought a mellow freedom like that in the Shire. And in 1965, when Ace Books published its unauthorized paperback volumes, it made LOTR at last affordable and huge. The authorized Valentine edition came out a short time after this bootleg copy, and the craze for Middle-earth erupted in America, especially on college campuses. Saylor has some, a Tolkien scholar, has some really good material on that. It had so Lord of the Rings had reached the vast U.S. mass market in the midst of a youth rebellion. Tolkien's reaction to being taken up as one of the beloved inspirations of this anarchistic vanguard of drugs, sex, and rock and roll I didn't even think about it at the time, but now I laugh when I think of how he must have responded to that. The UK Tolkien Society was formed, at least in part, as a counterweight to what they considered that co-optation of the author's world by this disreputable U.S. counterculture movement. Vera Chapman, one of the initiators of the UK Tolkien Society, did so in order to, quote, reclaim Middle-earth from squatters who had misappropriated it, such as the hippie movement. She also asserted that, quote, hippies stood for everything that Middle-earth rejected: drugs, sex, dropping out, and, quote, doing your own thing. And that they had misconstrued Lord of the Rings as much as you possibly could misconstrue it. Okay. Thus, the Tolkien Society was founded to preserve a particular interpretation of Tolkien's secondary world against this threat, from the youth of the time. One of the Tolkien Society's aims at that time, and those somewhat today, is to maintain the image of Middle-earth uncontaminated by anything contrary to the intentions of the author. Now, given that Tolkien is not alive at this time, it's kind of difficult for us to imagine what those might be, particularly if we take into consideration that if he were alive, he would still be thinking and reading and interacting with other people. So take that for what it's worth. Kate Coker notes in a myth lore article that Tolkien himself had an awkward relationship with his fans, but the American ones in particular. Quote, "The respectable professor did not care for his book's adoption by the counterculture movements at the time, although he later did appreciate the degree to which they loudly and energetically participated in the protest against the unauthorized editions which were released in the United States." Saylor also points out that one of the fanzine editors at the time split the more scholarly fans into two distinct groups also. The people who study linguistics, histories, and things out of the appendices, and the others who study implications of the Lord of the Rings in their own lives in the real world. Neither the first nor the last division among fans, neither the objection to the counterculture co-optation or the different literary approaches among fans would be the last of the ways that fans argue about how to interact with Tolkien's legendarium. Even within Tolkien scholarship today, there is a division still of, quote, Tolkien Studies scholarship, which is very traditional kind of English lit teacher way of going about it, which studies Tolkien as an author and his works as works of literature, and Middle-earth studies, which is the detailed and obsessive analysis of the actual works themselves, the histories, the languages, the creatures, you know, all of those discussions about do Balrogs have wings, and you know, we all have our opinion on that. Of course they don't have, and I can prove that. In my own fandom involvement as a fanfic writer with a very particular audience and a provider of resources, I find myself crossing back and forth across that line, though, because I'm writing for people who want to know the details of these character biographies that I write on the one hand. On the other hand, the more that I write them, the more I get into sources and Tolkien's style and that kind of more traditional type of Tolkien scholarship. Anyway, so then the other line drawn in the sand, has to do with the characterizations of genre within fan fiction. The slash hat, which slash is just almost everyone in this room know what that is.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Pretty much, I guess that takes time to describe it, but it's basically you know, same-sex couples as opposed to heterosexual romantic relationships. Genfic, which may talk about family and marriages, but kind of stays away from romance, per se. And then there are the very canon-observant people, like Stories of Arda is a good example of that, where if it contradicts anything in the text, then it's not a fit subject for fan fiction. Whereas many people write fan fiction as if, when Dawn talks about her survey, she can explain that in numbers, because they want to go someplace else with the story. They're in love with the world and the people that live there, and they want to make it relevant to their own storytelling form. Okay, so the largest explosion of fanfic took place immediately following the release of the first Peter Jackson movie, even when it was still in the publicity stage, which was massive if anybody was alive then and remembers, I do. Again, serendipity affected Tolkien's upsurge in popularity. There was this congruence of widespread personal internet use and the release of the LOTR film series, which had, according to John Leonard, The effect on fanfic at large is throwing a tanker load of gasoline on a campfire. You know, there was the means and there was the interest, and it exploded. Initially at the forefront of internet sites principally dedicated to providing a venue for Tolkien fan fiction were the Yahoo groups. I even came a little bit late to those. The first big multi-fandom site, fanfiction.net, was actually launched in October 1999, while the earliest Tolkien/fanfic list, founded by Amy Fortuna, went online a month before that, September 1999, under the name of Tolkien/. Amy Fortuna granted me some priceless information from those early days that I missed by a couple of years. Says, quote, "The first 2 years of the list, we were a really small, close-knit community, maybe 100 or so people at most, with about 25 or so regular posters, very book-based," quote. Yeah, this was to be one of dozens of social media platforms to provide space for fan discussion and to provide a venue for particular genre of Tolkien fan fiction. In the case of Amy's group, it was flash fiction. Another popular fan fiction writer, Kayleese, also recently described the Yahoo groups to me, noting that they were, quote, "a loose but recognizable community. I feel like a grandmother talking about the good old days, but they had all the energy, excitement, and enthusiasm of Tumblr, but were also highly interactive and much more personal," close quote. Two areas which have been flashpoints within the Tolkien fandom over the years are the attitudes about slash fiction and also the ones, as I mentioned earlier, about canon. The canon question is, what comprises canon? How ought it to be used? Attitudes about canon are still irreconcilable, some of which Dawn reflects in her survey data. Fans' positions range from trying to define precisely what Tolkien intended as his canon, if he ever indeed intended there could be an exact one, and to, on the far other end, a total disregard for the text. Of course, there's, you know, the movie book and the verse book people falling on either end in the most extreme manifestations of it. Interestingly enough, though, is the fact that many of the people who know Tolkien's canon the best and who study it the most and whose work reflects serious knowledge of all of everything from, you know, all 12 volumes of Home to LOTR and the Silmarillion, etc., are considered canon heretics because they chose to write serious fan fiction or silly fan fiction that is very deeply embedded in the facts of well, departing when they feel like it, or saying that there is more than one interpretation for this based on their research. Dawn, maybe I could turn on those websites now?
Yep. Excuse me, sure.
I'm sorry. I should have had a drink.
I interpreted more than one.
Well, both ways. My daughter claimed I definitely should have had a drink before I left the house this morning. I'm just insufferable this
We
week.
navigate with the keys or with the mouse.
One of my favorite writers, Pandemonium, I don't know if anyone in here has ever read her stuff. She's of the, how do you pronounce it, science fiction?
Science fiction?
Yeah, school of writing where she likes to deal with scientific questions and within a very robust narrative style of a epic stories. Said to me some time ago, not recently, as I examine JRTT's work, canon becomes more and more nebulous to me, particularly in the context of his mythopoeia, I always get that wrong. In our primary world, tales of a people's mythology vary. There is no governing body of rules or officially recognized books in myth, unlike canon, which is more defined. The Silmarillion and the tales in Home, History of Middle-earth, fall under the mythological as far as I can see. Okay, just a few things. Where are we now? Oh, Stories of Arda. Oh, am I out of time?
We have to be really brief.
Okay, so I tell you what, I won't go through these.
Okay.
Let me just give one summary, and then I'll give it over to you. You should have yelled at me sooner. Okay, I appreciate what is said in the Tolkien Encyclopedia. Very few authors inspire readers to learn invented languages, teach themselves new alphabets, or struggle to master the complexities of history and politics written in the form of thousands of years' worth of annals. This is what we're willing and eager to do with Tolkien, and it says a whole lot about him as a writer. Sorry, Dawn.
Oh, no, you're fine. We're still within our...
Spitting distance.
Yeah.
We're up against lunch, so I don't think it's as unforgiving a boundary as another.
Oh,
like
thank you.
Yeah, I said that too, but I didn't want to,
John made all these beautiful,
Yeah, I did this on the train yesterday while I was stuck, which is
I love this one.
unfortunately a tragic one. My train actually hit and killed somebody on my way. I live in Vermont, so
Oh
my
my
way down
God.
from Vermont. Yeah. So while I was stuck on the train yesterday, then Janet and I were corresponding via email and putting this together. So I put some facts from my survey, which I'm going to talk about in a second up there about Tolkien fan fiction writers. Actually, I think I skipped my first slide, which was a funny one. I don't know if that went up. If not, we'll repeat it again. So research into online fan fiction communities is complicated. Even though the mainstream media has come around to seeing fan fiction as more than teenage wish fulfillment fantasies and the lovelorn pinings of cat ladies, then, and here's some of the actual facts of who we are up here that I won't have time to go through. Many people can't or don't want to admit they write fan fiction for a lot of reasons. The internet enables ephemerality in a way that wasn't possible in the era of the print fanzines. When we embarked on this project, Janet and I realized we had this really weird conundrum. We were looking on one hand at the old stuff, the like Amy Fortuna's groups and the Yahoo groups Janet was talking about, and in a lot of cases, those moderators have long absconded from fan fiction, so that stuff is no longer accessible. You can no longer even get into those groups. Then we're looking at recent stuff, which is largely hosted on things like Tumblr, and I know we have some Tumblr users here. And so you know that searching for anything that's more than 5 seconds old on Tumblr is like searching for the proverbial needle in the haystack. So we were getting it from both sides. So that's certainly one of the complications that we faced. Also, I mean, we have to be honest about the fact that Janet and I are both writers, and I'm an archive owner within this community. We're not academics coming in from the outside. So we bring our own biases, and since we're friends and we write similar types of fiction and we write on the same website, then those biases march pretty much in lockstep. So it's worth keeping in mind that you brought in a different archive owner to stand in my position, you might be getting completely different perspective on some of these results I had. So when I first started researching the Tolkien fanfic community, then I encountered these complications, and I was like, well, how can I surmount this? And so I was getting ready to give a presentation on Tolkien fanfic at MythMoot, and so I decided to run a fanfiction survey and try to entice as many Tolkien fanfic writers as I could to take my survey. So there's some details up there that you can certainly read through for yourself if you're interested. We ended up with 1,052 valid responses. Once I threw out the responses from people who responded to a fanfic survey that didn't actually write or read fanfic, which was interesting. And 642 of our participants were authors, and those are the people we're looking at today. I haven't looked at the readers yet. I've just finished a master's thesis, so my work on this data is very, very, very new. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, I put my card here with my blog on it. I'm going through weekly, and I'm doing basically, throwing out a batch of results every week. Also, if there's any other researchers out there that would like to have the raw data for yourselves, again, grab my card, send me an email, and I will happily share that with you. I don't have it publicly available, but it's open to whomever wants to use it. There's a sample of how the items were written that we used on the survey. It was mostly a statement, and then you have the 5 options. So you'll see that again as we go through. Some of the limitations, again, I always want to caution, we tend in our society to sometimes think, because we can attach a number to it, then it's absolute. It actually kind of gets back into what Christine Larson was saying about, integrating the A into STEAM, the arts into, that's sometimes an uneasy transition. We're not sure how, to measure when we're talking about art in this way, what ways do math and literature work together. So we certainly I had difficulty in reaching some major fanfic communities, notably fanfiction.net, and then some, especially my group, the Silmarillion Writers Guild, for obvious reasons, and Tumblr, because people reblog things like wildfire on there, were relatively easy to reach. So there's going to be probably an overrepresentation of those people on the survey. Of course, you always have the casual writers who are less likely. You have the veteran fans who have long since left the scene. Their opinions are not going to be represented. You always have the issue that we say we do one thing and then we actually do the other. So we say, oh yes, I review every story that I read, but we actually only review maybe 1 out of every 10 stories that we read. That's always an issue in social science research. And of course, my Dawn Felagund bias, I am more likely to reach Silmarillion fans with a scholarly or critical bent because those are the people that follow me. Not really a lot of people that have other motives that are equally worthy, but that maybe aren't interested in my work. So here's the list of archives which we included. We basically looked at any one where my participants had 5% or more of my participants used them. So we ended up with 15. It's a nice mix of Tolkien-only archives, multi-fandom archives, and then social media like Tumblr and LiveJournal that have been very big over the years for Tolkien fan fiction. So what we come into with this is what creates an archives culture. So this was something Janet was going to touch on a little bit with her going through each of the 15 sites we used. We have formal impositions that are things like the site's purpose, so what we include. So my Silmarillion Writers Guild, we include fiction based on the Silmarillion. You have gatekeeping, so what we exclude. We don't exclude anything that's legal on my site, but other sites will exclude, say, /fiction. A slash site may exclude, non-slash stories. And then, of course, you have your site policies and rules. So, actually, I lied. The SWD does require you to spell check your work before you post it. So that would be a rule. But what we're more looking at is what's informal here. So what actually from our members makes a culture on a site. And we'll see in my data that a lot of times this formal stuff, so the things that people like me that actually create these websites and run them say is our purpose, sometimes isn't what our members actually end up. They'll take it in a different direction or they'll take it beyond maybe what we intended. Which is kind of, we'll see that again and again in the results. Okay, so Tolkien was a self-described reactionary and a devout Catholic, and attempting to adhere to his morality would mark off limits many of the genres and topics we typically explore in fan fiction. So this is a big issue in our community. To what extent do we need to adhere to Tolkien's morality? Some fans certainly believe that respecting Tolkien's beliefs are an essential part of writing fiction within his world. The guidelines for authors on the stories of Arda makes this explicit. It reads, stories on this site should reflect a respect for Tolkien's work, both the overriding themes as well as the events he wrote about. Other fanfic authors feel that Tolkien's morality should not limit the use of his works to topic or content he would have approved of. This was what Janet got into with the heretics. The reason I raised my hand there is because my blog is called The Heretic War Master, so clearly I self-identify as one of those people. But we're often part of the wilder fringes, as the Tolkien Society stated, with respect to the hippies, that they felt were misappropriating Tolkien's works. We use our stories to do things like offer feminist commentary, explore issues of gender and sexuality, present alternate readings of the morality of characters like Feanor and Sauron, and consider issues of spirituality that go beyond the pale of Christianity. Others add eroticism to the legendarium or irreverent comic reimaginings of characters and events. Okay, so I looked at 2 statements in my survey related to this issue. So let me explain, first of all, how I set up these little graphics I'm giving you all. Up here is my statement that I'm asking people to agree or disagree with. This is for all of our participants as a whole, so that whole 642 authors, the ones that chose to answer that. So for this statement, we have 15.1%, all the way over there. The top 3 I marked in red, and the bottom 3 I marked in blue. So it's easy at a glance to see which ones were the most likely to agree and which ones were most likely to disagree. At least I hope so. Just humor me if it's not. And then there's a gray area which is not showing up terribly well, at least from my perspective, and this is within 5% of that overall. So it shows you for which ones maybe this isn't so much of an important issue. So our first statement says, it is important to me to write stories that I think Tolkien would have approved of. You see our 15.1% number shows that's not a terribly important issue in general, but still 15% of people would say so, and I think that's higher than you would find for fan fiction in general. I think if you were to ask in a more traditional like media fandom, then that number would be a lot lower. Okay, so there's a couple of observations I want to make here, and something we'll see again, which is, first of all, that older sites tend to put more of an emphasis on morality, and this kind of shows the direction that Tolkien fan fiction has taken over the years as we become more integrated with fan fiction in general. We used to be a very isolated community, and that's less true today with sites like Archive of Our Own, which is down here, so they're very, mark this is very unimportant. They're relatively new. Tumblr, again, they keep coming up. And then the other observation I would make is that, we have Many Paths to Tread, which is a genfic archive. It's rather important to them. Janet touched on what genfic is. It's basically a story form, a genre, where there's a lack of explicit content, versus defining it by, the type of pairing, female-female, male-male, male-female pairings. But what's interesting here is that Tolkien fan fiction was the highest. More than a third of their writers, more than well over double overall, agreed or strongly agreed with this statement. And what's interesting about this is that Tolkien fan fiction places no restrictions on their content. They accept everything. They're a spin-off from a Yahoo group, so you have to belong to the Yahoo group. But other than that, if it's like it's me with the SWG, if it's legal, you can post it. This shows that, the culture of the site, what the members determine, is sometimes more important than what the policies of the site itself dictate. So we also looked at, it is important to keep my stories consistent with Tolkien's moral beliefs. Slightly more people, 21.5% for this one. And again, we see similar things. We see our two genfic archives, Many Paths to Tread and Stories of Arda. Here are high up. And Tolkien fan fiction, again, is almost half. Of our writers on that site are saying that this is true for them. The site, again, places no rules on what you can post there. Stories of Arda has the strictest rules of the 15 sites that we looked at. And you see they're falling below Many Paths to Tread, which is the other site that I moderate for. And Many Paths to Tread, their policies were written deliberately for inclusion of as many genres as possible. And I say that from experience because that was when I came on board as a moderator, and my guidelines for the SWG were used very heavily in creating the guidelines for MPTT. So again, what we envisioned when we built that site, and where its members have taken it, are different. So again, you see where members are creating the culture, not so much the administrators. Okay, we also looked at slightly different issue. When writing fan fiction, it is important to me to stick to the facts that Tolkien gave in his books. Again, Stories of Arda and Tolkien fan fiction are right up there. That should be no surprise after the last two, perhaps. But what's interesting here is Library of Moria. Is anyone familiar with that site other than Janet and Marta? Okay, Library of Moria is the big Tolkien / archive, and they've been around forever. They're older than, I don't know the exact year, but I know they're older than the SWG. Yeah. And the SWG is 11, so they've been around for a while. Now, most people think, when they probably think of / fiction, they don't think of sticking to the facts that Tolkien gave in his books. And this gets into what Janet was talking about with canon, and how on our sites, a lot of times our culture revolves around how we define canon. Tolkien didn't have any explicit same-sex pairings in his books, which probably is not a surprise to anyone. There are some subtextual ones. Frodo and Sam have been popular over the years. From my Silmarillion side, of course, Maedhros and Fingon are the two big ones. So, you can, if you talk to a fan of either of those pairings, they will give you a laundry list of subtext that causes, them to believe that those two may have been more than platonic. But, not the facts as we would normally think of in the book, but this gets into canon and how we define it. And Janet talked about this. And a lot of times it's tempting to think that canon is just the facts in the text. Well, you know, we're a room full of Tolkien scholars here. We all know that the facts in the text contradict each other sometimes, that he changed his mind at a crazy rapid speed and then changed it back again. And even beyond that, we have issues that, you know, start to pull into how you write fan fiction. And something that, for example, that I've written about a lot is narrative bias. You know, the narrative bias of the, you know, fictional lore masters like McCullough that he created, and how that affected what he was including versus what he was leaving out. And as fan fiction writers, we exploit that or use that, however you want to put that at times. And someone like me, who is rather heretical to continue to use the term that we've been using in our construction of fan fiction, is going to say, that's okay, you know, that's a fact from the text that McCullough wrote the Silmarillion, you know, depending on which draft you read. You would also, other ones would say it's Numenorians, but that gets back into the consistency in and among texts there. But, you know, I would say McCullough's authorship of the text is a fact, and so that is something I can work in to factually consistent fan fiction. And so when you see a site like Library of Moria that's saying, you know, well, we take the facts very seriously, that's what's going in there. They're not just saying, you know, well, because Tolkien stated it in this way, they're adding an extra level of interpretation, but they're taking it seriously and basing it on the text, not just on spitting it out of nowhere in their minds. Not that there's anything wrong with that. So let's switch over to the heretical questions now. So I asked, writing fan fiction lets me challenge Tolkien's worldview, and again, we see the newer sites are the big ones here. The ones that have only been around for 10 years or less, with the exception of the SWG, which I'll talk about in a second. So Tumblr, Archive of Our Own, and Dreamwidth, they're all relatively new to the scene, and they're the ones that have the most heretics, so to speak, on them. And down here we have our older sites that have been around a while, or Many Paths to Tread is a genfic site, and like I said, their membership has taken their culture in that direction. You know, even though we as administrators made it as inclusive of a site as we could. And again, we see that on the next statement I asked about, which was writing Tolkien fan fiction lets me criticize Tolkien's world. And again, we have Tumblr, Dreamwidth, and Yahoo Groups appears in there. And then we have my SWG again. And the point I want to make with this is that even though, you know, I self-identify as a canon heretic, and that was not one of my missions in starting that site. It is certainly not anything I impose upon people that want to post there. I don't say, well, if this isn't how you read the books, you can't post on my site. That is certainly not the case. However, writers like me and Janet, who both post there a lot, Pandemonium, who she referenced earlier, who's a very popular author there, Keyless, who's also a popular author there, we tend to these types of interpretations. And so, again, you see us as members, well, I mean, I'm an administrator and a member, but you see us pulling the culture of the site in a particular direction, independent of what I, as the creator, try to impose and saying everyone is welcome. You know, there are still people that would say they don't feel welcome because they don't write that kind of fiction, so they don't feel welcome to necessarily post it there. So, I talked about a lot of pages before I got to this point. Okay, so social justice kind of falls under that umbrella. So writing fan fiction helps me to correct problems with race, gender, and sexuality that I see in Tolkien's books. And again, we see the newer sites. This is important. Probably anyone that uses Tumblr not being surprised that 3/4 of Tumblr users see this as something that they view as important. Same with AO3, Archive of Our Own, which overlaps a lot with Tumblr. SWG is in there again, which honestly did surprise me a little bit. But what I found interesting here is that Library of Moria, we'll get back into our /archive again, does not view this as important. Social justice fanfic, for those who may not be familiar with it, attempt to correct issues of representation and bias in the original text. So most people have probably heard the familiar stat that like 18% of named characters in Tolkien's books are women. You know, clearly that suggests a bias. There were no homosexual or bisexual couples in the books. So these writers try to correct that by either by creating these identities for characters, or playing up the stories of characters who maybe don't get the spotlight, like women, characters of color, so on, showing their perspectives more than the original text did. So what's interesting is that Library of Moria doesn't find this to be an important issue, and that surprised me, honestly, at first, because I'm like, well, they write same-sex pairings, right? So you would think that that would be a big issue for them. But what I came to realize that this shows is that, our motives, and I'm going to show a graphic at the end that shows all of this data together that kind of shows what I'm talking about. I'm a visual person, so I always feel like I want to show a visual to explain it, but our motives in writing fan fiction don't necessarily march lockstep, and each archive really has its own independent mix of motives. So social justice and writing slash don't go together in this case. It's just a different type of fiction that they're writing. And we see that again here with writing fan fiction allows me to explore or enjoy my sexuality. Now Library of Moria is all the way at the top there, 59.6%. Adultfanfiction.org, 55%. So those are our two archives that were created explicitly to host adult content. And then, so obviously they would make sense to be there. But again, you see the newer sites again, as we're moving away from that conservative sort of way that Tolkien fandom has often acted. We see the newer sites are kind of breaking free of that a little bit. Archive of Our Own and Tumblr again. Fairy is the newest of the Tolkien-specific archives that we looked at. It's only been around for maybe 5 or 6 years, if that. I think it's actually probably closer to 5. So we see that, again, so the social justice and just writing sexuality into a story, because of it, they're not linked up in the minds of a lot of people, which did surprise me until I really thought about it. Okay, so here's the big graphic that I was talking about that shows that. So you see how very few of my little circles and my little overlaps, and I realize the rendering by the LCD projector kind of makes some of that at the bottom kind of hard to distinguish.
Do you want me to flip the light for a second?
Yes, if that would help, certainly.
I think it really.
Yeah, it probably would.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can find the lights.
But there's no single section in this graphic that contains more than 2 of the 15 sites we looked at.
The switch is
Right
down below that.
Oh, yeah, it is. It's
Below.
Below.
Down on
Oh,
Walls-Thumma.
Jesus.
there's like 5 of them. There's hopefully the right one.
There you go.
Ooh,
That's the right one.
That's
That works.
much better.
Okay.
Yes, that's better. Thank you, Janet. Okay, so you see that, while we have some overlap, then there's not necessarily, where we don't have a whole lot of crowding into one particular area. It really shows the diversity of our community in how we interpret and work with the text. That every archive really is just a little bit different than its, neighbors. So the title of this paper is Borders of the Fictional World. As I've spent the last 1.5 years researching the Tolkien fanfic community, I've come to think of its archives as similar to physical geography. Few authors can move with complete ease and freedom between all of our community's online spaces, any more than most people can move with complete ease and freedom between the nations of the world. In some cases, there are actual barriers. An author who writes Aragorn and Arwen romances will never be able to post to the Library of Moria because it's a slash archive. It's unlikely they will be able to ever post with my site, the Silmarillion Writers Guild, even though it's not beyond the realm of possibility, but it's unlikely. And personally speaking, as an LGBT ally, I cannot in good conscience post my work on sites that ban same-sex pairings, even if I only rarely write them myself. Sites that continue to do so effectively bar my entry. These are the formal impositions I talked about before. Then there are the cultural differences that make interchanges not impossible, perhaps, but difficult. As we have seen, each Tolkien fanfic archive has a unique culture. Some value Tolkien's morality very highly, the ones in blue up here in the corner. Others find reward in writing and reading fanfic that critically examines and even challenges the foundations of the legendarium. For some authors, fitting the details of the canon together is as rewarding as completing a difficult jigsaw puzzle. Some see their fan fiction as a way to discuss and correct problems with representation and bias in the original sources. Still others enjoy adding sexuality to the legendarium. None of these motives march lockstep with each other, and the combination in which they exist produces the cultures of the various Tolkien fanfic archives. These site cultures simultaneously create community and conflict. 65% of survey participants agreed with the statement, "I have a site or archive that I view as my Tolkien fandom home." At the same time, 30% agreed that there are sites or archives where I don't post my stories because I don't feel welcome there. And 26% agreed that there are sites or archives where I don't post my stories because I don't agree with the approach writers there take towards Tolkien's books. This reflects a pattern that has been present since the inception of the Tolkien fandom after the publication of The Lord of the Rings. Over the decades since The Lord of the Rings was published, new fans have been periodically injected into the fandom through increased access to the Legendarium, the unauthorized Ace Books version, the rise of internet fandom, and 6 blockbuster movies. Each wave of new fans brings new ideas, creates tension and resistance from veteran fans, provokes gatekeeping from those veteran fans, and often creates new fan spaces. The Tolkien fanfic community is no exception, and we can see the results of those conflicts in the cultures and values present in our online spaces. At the same time, fandom and fanfiction as a whole have burgeoned in the post-internet era. The gasoline on the tanker truck, or the match on the gasoline truck analogy that Janet quoted from John Leonard earlier. And this has not left the Tolkien community untouched. For many years, the Tolkien fanfic community was largely isolated and very different from the fanfic world at large. As I noted earlier, fan studies scholars have long accepted as a matter of fact that fanfiction inherently presumes a rejection of the author's authority in favor of the authority of the fan. And as we have seen, that is certainly not always the case in the Tolkien community. But we have also seen the boundaries between the Tolkien community and the broader fanfic world beginning to dissolve, facilitated by sites like AO3 and Tumblr, where multi-fandom participation is the norm, and the Tolkien fandom is just one among many. How this will impact the cultures of our fandom's archives, whether we'll ease the antipathy that sometimes exists between fans, erase our fandom's cultures altogether, or both, or neither, remains to be seen.